So tell me, waitress, the billionaire said with a faint smile, tapping his platinum card against the marble table. If you had $1 million, where would you invest it? The question drifted across the dining room like a joke everyone was expected to understand. A few men at the table chuckled quietly, swirling glasses of sparkling water and discussing market forecasts as if they were talking about the weather. The restaurant glowed with warm light from crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where a single dinner bill could equal a week's rent in Manhattan. Conversations floated through the air about venture capital, acquisitions, and quarterly earnings, each sentence heavy with numbers most people would only see in newspapers. Emily Carter moved between the tables with quiet precision, balancing a tray of drinks while the polished floor reflected the soft gold lighting above. At 26, she had mastered the art of being invisible in places like this. Guests rarely looked at her face. They looked at the uniform, the tray, the service. To them, she was simply part of the background, like the music playing softly from hidden speakers. She approached the billionaire's table with professional calm and placed a glass of sparkling water beside his hand. His name was Jonathan Reed, a man whose face appeared regularly in business magazines, the founder of a hedge fund rumored to control more than $7 billion in assets. He was known in financial circles for his sharp instincts and his habit of testing people when he was bored. Tonight seemed to be one of those nights. Relax, Jonathan said to the men around him, leaning back in his chair. I'm curious. His gray eyes shifted toward Emily with mild amusement. Go ahead. Give me your best investment strategy. A few of his colleagues laughed again. One of them whispered something about asking the chef for stock tips next. Emily didn't laugh. She stood still for a moment, holding her notepad, her expression calm but unreadable. The noise of the dining room continued around them, forks against porcelain plates, quiet music humming beneath the conversations of wealthy guests who never worried about overdue bills or grocery prices. Jonathan expected the waitress to smile politely and walk away. That was how these moments usually ended. Instead, Emily set the water pitcher gently on the table and met his gaze for the first time. There was nothing defiant about her expression, just a quiet steadiness. 40% into emerging market renewable energy ETFs, she said calmly. 30% into undervalued mid-cap industrial companies that are currently trading below intrinsic value. 20% municipal bonds for the tax advantage. And keep 10% liquid for opportunistic acquisitions during market corrections. The laughter stopped. It didn't fade gradually. It simply stopped. One of the men froze with his glass halfway to his lips. Another slowly lowered his fork. Jonathan Reed blinked once, then placed his phone face down on the table. For the first time since the conversation started, he looked directly at the waitress, studying her as if something about the world had suddenly shifted out of place. That's oddly specific, he said quietly. Emily gave a small polite nod, the same nod she gave every customer. Just an opinion, sir. But Jonathan Reed was no longer smiling. Because in 15 seconds, the quiet waitress had just outlined an investment strategy that sounded disturbingly similar to the one his senior analysts had spent 3 weeks building. Jonathan Reed did not speak for several seconds. The dining room around them continued its quiet rhythm, but at table 12 something had shifted. He leaned back slowly in his chair, his eyes still fixed on Emily Carter, as if he were recalculating something invisible. Where did you hear that strategy? He asked at last, his voice calmer now, but noticeably more focused. Emily held her notepad against her palm with the same calm posture she had shown since the beginning of her shift. I read financial news sometimes, she replied politely. One of the men at the table gave a short laugh that sounded uncertain. Come on, he said, glancing at Jonathan. She memorized that from somewhere. Jonathan did not laugh. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the edge of the table. Explain the renewable energy position, he said. The request landed between them like a challenge. Emily hesitated for half a second and glanced across the dining room, where another table was waiting for their drinks. For a moment it looked like she might excuse herself and walk away. That would have been the normal ending to a moment like this. Instead she spoke again, just as calmly as before. Western markets are already saturated with green investment funds, she said. Too much capital chasing. Too few projects. It creates inflated valuations. One of the businessmen slowly lowered his glass. Emily continued without raising her voice. Emerging markets are different. Countries in Southeast Asia and parts of Latin America are expanding energy infrastructure quickly. Governments are offering tax incentives to attract foreign capital, which increases potential return on investment. In the long term, the growth curve is stronger. The words were not rushed. They were not rehearsed. They sounded like something she had thought about many times before. Jonathan Reed's expression changed again, though only slightly. The small amused smile that had been on his face earlier was gone now. "And the industrial stocks?" he asked. Emily nodded once. "Manufacturing indexes in the United States have been declining for 3 quarters, which is causing mid-cap industrial companies to trade below their intrinsic value. Some of those companies still have strong fundamentals. When the supply chain stabilizes, their valuations will recover." The table had gone completely quiet now. Even the background music seemed distant. Jonathan studied her face carefully. Not the uniform, not the tray, her face, as if trying to understand something that did not fit his expectations. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that you built a diversified $1 million portfolio in about 15 seconds. Emily gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. "You asked for my opinion, sir." One of the men shook his head softly. "Jonathan, that is almost identical to the strategy your analysts proposed last week." Jonathan did not respond to him. His attention never left Emily. For a moment the billionaire looked less like the most confident man in the room and more like someone who had just discovered a puzzle worth solving. Then he asked a quieter question. "What is your name?" Emily hesitated, then answered with the same simple tone she used with every guest. "Emily Carter." Jonathan repeated the name once under his breath, as if committing it to memory. Then he reached for his phone again. But this time he was not checking messages. He was sending one. A short message to someone who worked for him. Only 4 words. Background check. Emily Carter. Tonight. When Emily turned and walked toward the kitchen to deliver another order, Jonathan watched her go. Not because she was a waitress. Because nothing about this situation made sense. And Jonathan Reed had built his entire fortune by uncovering things that did not make sense. The rest of the evening continued, but the atmosphere at table 12 had changed in a way no one could quite explain. Jonathan Reed finished his dinner slowly, though he barely tasted the food placed in front of him. His attention kept drifting across the dining room toward the quiet waitress who moved from table to table with calm efficiency. Emily Carter carried plates, refilled water glasses, and spoke politely with customers who never realized that 15 minutes earlier she had outlined a financial strategy that could manage a 7-figure portfolio. To everyone else in the restaurant, she was simply doing her job. But Jonathan Reed no longer saw a waitress. He saw a question that did not have an answer yet. When Emily returned with the bill folder, she placed it neatly on the table beside his plate. "Whenever you are ready, sir," she said gently. Jonathan looked up at her again, studying her expression carefully. There was no pride there. No sign that she understood how unusual the last conversation had been. She looked exactly the same as before. Calm, professional, invisible. Jonathan signed the receipt without looking at the total and then added a tip large enough to make one of his colleagues raise his eyebrows. "That is generous," the man beside him murmured quietly. Jonathan closed the folder and stood, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored jacket. "Consider it consulting fees," he said calmly, though his eyes followed Emily as she walked toward another table across the room. Outside, the Manhattan evening air felt cool and clean compared to the warmth of the restaurant. The city moved at its usual restless pace. Yellow taxis rolled past in long lines. People hurried along the sidewalk carrying shopping bags and briefcases, each person wrapped inside their own schedule. Jonathan stepped into the back seat of his black car, just as his phone vibrated softly in his hand. The message arrived sooner than he expected. His assistant rarely disappointed. Jonathan opened the file while the car pulled into traffic. At first the report looked ordinary. Name, age, current employment. Emily Carter, 26 years old. Works evening shifts at Leland and Park Restaurant. Address listed in a modest apartment building on the Upper West Side. Jonathan scrolled further. Then his eyes paused on the next line. Columbia University. Finance program. Jonathan leaned forward slightly in his seat. That detail alone already explained more than he had expected. But the report continued. Academic record excellent. Grade point average nearly perfect. Scholarship recipient. Completed 3 years of study. Jonathan frowned slightly. 3 years. Not 4. The next line explained why. Enrollment status, withdrawn. 3 years ago. Reason listed, financial hardship due to family medical expenses. Jonathan leaned back slowly, staring at the quiet glow of the screen in his hand as the car moved through the city lights. Outside the window, glass towers reflected the streets below like mirrors. Inside the car, Jonathan Reed said nothing for several moments. He had spent his life surrounded by analysts from elite universities, people who competed aggressively for positions inside his company. Yet somewhere in Manhattan, a woman who had nearly finished one of the best finance programs in the country was carrying trays and refilling coffee cups. Jonathan looked at the report again, reading the name once more. Emily Carter. Then he spoke quietly to the driver in the front seat. Turn around. The driver glanced briefly in the rearview mirror. Back to the restaurant, sir? Jonathan closed the report on his phone and looked out at the city lights reflecting across the glass window. Yes, he said calmly. I have another question for that waitress. 20 minutes later, the black car rolled quietly back to the curb outside the restaurant. The dining room inside was still glowing with warm light, and through the tall glass windows Jonathan Reed could see the same steady rhythm continuing inside. Plates moved from kitchen to table. Conversations rose and fell like soft waves. Nothing about the place suggested that anything unusual had happened earlier that evening. But Jonathan Reed knew better now. He stepped out of the car and walked back inside, his polished shoes tapping lightly across the marble floor. The host looked up immediately, surprised to see him return so soon. Welcome back, Mr. Reed, the host said politely. Jonathan gave a small nod, but his eyes were already scanning the room. He found her near the far corner of the dining area, balancing a tray with 2 plates and speaking softly to an older couple seated by the window. Emily Carter looked exactly the same as before. The same calm posture, the same quiet presence that blended into the restaurant like part of the furniture. Jonathan waited until she finished serving the table before he stepped closer. Emily turned and paused slightly when she recognized him standing there again. Did something get left behind, sir? She asked politely. Jonathan shook his head. No, I came back. Emily tilted her head just slightly, curious but still professional. Is there something I can help you with? Jonathan studied her face again, the same careful expression he used when evaluating a complicated business proposal. For a moment he said nothing. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket and placed it gently on the edge of a nearby table. The screen displayed a dense financial report filled with numbers and charts. I have a question, he said calmly. Emily glanced at the phone screen but did not step closer yet. About dinner service? She asked. Jonathan allowed a faint smile to appear for the first time since returning. Not exactly. He turned the phone so the screen faced her fully. This report outlines a potential acquisition my firm has been evaluating for 3 months. Emily looked at the document quietly. The report showed projected revenue growth, supply chain forecasts, and several pages of financial modeling. It was the type of analysis usually handled by a team of experienced analysts working long hours inside expensive offices downtown. Jonathan folded his arms loosely and watched her reaction carefully. My analysts believe the company is undervalued, he said. They recommend we move forward with a $200 million investment. Emily said nothing yet. Her eyes moved slowly across the screen, scanning the rows of numbers the same way someone reads a familiar language. After several seconds, she looked back up at him. And you are not convinced, she said calmly. Jonathan's eyebrow lifted slightly. Why would you assume that? Emily gave a small polite shrug. Because if you were convinced, you would not be asking a waitress. Jonathan held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. Fair point. He tapped the screen lightly. So tell me something, Miss Carter. Emily waited. The restaurant around them continued moving as if nothing unusual was happening. Glasses clinked. Music hummed softly from the ceiling speakers. Jonathan leaned forward slightly and asked the question that had brought him back through the door. If you had 30 seconds to find the flaw in this report, where would you start? Emily looked down at the phone. Again, the numbers filled the screen like a maze. She did not reach for the phone. She did not rush. She simply studied the report quietly while the billionaire waited. And after exactly 20 seconds, Emily Carter pointed to a single line in the financial projection and said 4 calm words that made Jonathan Reed's expression change completely. Your growth assumption is wrong. Jonathan Reed did not react immediately. He simply stared at the line Emily had pointed to on the screen, his eyes narrowing slightly as his mind moved through the numbers again. The growth assumption, he repeated quietly. Emily nodded once, still calm. Yes. Jonathan tapped the screen and expanded the section she indicated. The projection chart showed steady revenue growth over the next 5 years, a model his analysts had built carefully using market forecasts and supplier contracts. My team spent weeks building this model, Jonathan said slowly. Emily did not look intimidated. She simply pointed again, this time at a smaller detail hidden beneath the main projections. Your analysts assumed the company can scale production by 30% within 18 months, she said. But the supply chain numbers in this report contradict that. Jonathan leaned closer to the screen. Explain. Emily spoke quietly, but her words were precise. The report shows their main manufacturing partner operates 2 plants in Ohio and 1 in Indiana. Combined capacity is currently 90,000 units per quarter. Even if they run at maximum efficiency, they cannot reach the projected output without building another facility. Jonathan's eyes flicked through the document quickly. She was right about the plant locations. Construction takes time, Emily continued. Permits, labor contracts, equipment installation. At minimum, that is 2 years. Jonathan looked back up at her. And the projection assumes expansion happens in 12 months, he said slowly. Emily nodded again. Which means your analysts assumed growth that cannot physically happen on the timeline they used. Jonathan said nothing. The noise of the restaurant filled the silence around them. A waiter passed carrying a tray of glasses. Someone laughed softly across the room. But at that small corner table, the atmosphere had gone completely still. Jonathan scrolled through the financial model again, following the supply chain section Emily had pointed out. The numbers lined up exactly the way she described. The capacity ceiling. The projected demand. The unrealistic timeline hiding quietly between the lines. He exhaled once and set the phone down on the table. That mistake alone could cost $200 million, he said quietly. Emily did not react to the number. She simply gave a small shrug. Possibly more, she said. Jonathan looked at her again, longer this time. You found that in 20 seconds. Emily gave a polite smile that carried no arrogance at all. You asked where I would start. For the first time that evening, Jonathan Reed laughed softly, though there was no mockery in the sound now. It was the laugh of someone who had just discovered something valuable. My senior analysts did not notice that, he said. Emily picked up the water pitcher she had set down earlier and glanced toward another table waiting for service. People often miss details when they expect things to work, she said gently. Jonathan leaned back slightly, considering her words. And you do not expect things to work? Emily paused before answering. I expect numbers to tell the truth. Jonathan watched her for a moment longer. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it beside the phone on the table. The card was simple. Just a name and a private phone number printed in clean black lettering. Emily Carter, he said calmly. My company employs 130 analysts. Emily looked at the card but did not reach for it yet. Jonathan continued, his voice steady. Tonight, a waitress found a flaw none of them saw. He slid the card a little closer toward her. When you decide you are done carrying trays, call me. Emily looked at the card quietly for several seconds. Then she picked it up, turning it between her fingers as if it were simply another receipt from the night service. When she looked back at Jonathan, her expression was still calm, still steady. Thank you, she said politely. But I am not sure that decision is as simple as it sounds. Emily Carter slipped the business card into the small pocket of her apron, the same way she stored order slips and receipts during a busy shift. To anyone watching, the moment would have looked ordinary. A customer leaving a card. A waitress nodding politely. Nothing more. But Jonathan Reed did not move. He remained standing beside the table, studying her expression carefully, as if the real answer to his offer had not been spoken yet. Emily lifted the water pitcher again and moved toward the next table waiting for service. The restaurant continued its steady rhythm around them, forks touching plates, quiet conversations about real estate, and stock prices drifting through the warm air. Jonathan watched as she refilled 2 glasses for a couple seated near the window. She smiled politely, wrote something on her notepad, and carried an empty plate back toward the kitchen. There was no sign of excitement in her movements. No sign that the card in her apron pocket represented an opportunity most analysts would chase for years. A few minutes later she returned to the dining room, and Jonathan was still there. He had taken a seat at the small table near the service station, his phone resting in front of him. Emily paused when she noticed him waiting. "Did you need something else, Mr. Reed?" she asked calmly. Jonathan leaned back slightly in the chair. "I am curious about something," he said. Emily waited. Jonathan gestured lightly toward the dining room around them. "You nearly finished one of the most competitive finance programs in the country. Your academic record is exceptional, yet you are working double shifts carrying trays." Emily did not look surprised that he knew about Columbia University. In fact, she looked almost amused. "You had someone look it up," she said. Jonathan did not deny it. "Information is useful." Emily gave a small nod as if that answer made perfect sense. She rested one hand lightly on the back of a nearby chair, still standing, but clearly not in a hurry to leave. "So now you know the interesting part of my story," she said. Jonathan studied her again. "No," he replied quietly. "I only know the part written in a report." Emily looked toward the kitchen doors for a moment before speaking again. "Reports are efficient," she said softly. "They do not include complicated details." Jonathan folded his hands on the table. "Such as?" Emily was quiet for a few seconds, as if deciding how much of the story was worth explaining. Finally she spoke. 3 years ago my mother needed medical treatment that insurance did not fully cover. Tuition at Columbia costs a little more than $60,000 a year. Jonathan listened carefully. "So you left school?" Emily nodded once. "Someone had to pay the bills." Jonathan glanced briefly at the dining room again. "And you never went back?" Emily's expression remained calm, but there was a quiet weight behind her answer. When life changes direction, it does not always pause so you can return later. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "But you still read financial reports for fun." Emily allowed herself a faint smile. "Numbers are easier to understand than people." Jonathan was silent for a moment after that. Then he looked at her with a different expression than before. Not curiosity this time. Respect. "Emily," he said calmly, "you are not wasting your potential. You are delaying it." Emily picked up her notepad again and glanced toward another table, signaling for service. Before she turned away, she said one quiet sentence that made Jonathan pause. "Sometimes delay and sacrifice look exactly the same from the outside." Then she walked away to continue her shift, leaving the billionaire sitting quietly at the small table, holding a realization he had not expected to find that evening. The night continued to move forward the way Manhattan nights always did, quietly busy and filled with people who believed the world followed predictable patterns. Emily Carter carried another tray across the dining room, while conversations about investments and property deals drifted between the tables. From a distance, nothing about her looked unusual. She was simply another waitress finishing another shift. But Jonathan Reed remained seated near the service station, watching the rhythm of the restaurant with a new awareness. For most of his life, he had evaluated people quickly. In his world, decisions were made in seconds. A person was either useful or they were not, talented or average, ambitious or replaceable. But Emily Carter did not fit into any category he understood. He had met analysts from Harvard and Stanford who could not dissect a financial report as quickly as she had. Yet here she was clearing plates and refilling water glasses while the city's financial district argued over billion-dollar strategies a few miles downtown. Jonathan glanced again at the business card he had given her earlier. Most people reacted to that card immediately. They asked questions. They followed him outside. They tried to negotiate before the opportunity disappeared. Emily Carter had simply placed it in her apron and returned to work. A few minutes later she approached his table again, this time carrying a small tray with a fresh glass of water. She placed it in front of him without being asked. "Complimentary refill," she said politely. Jonathan looked at the glass and then back at her. "I did not ask for this." Emily gave a small shrug. "You have been sitting here for 30 minutes thinking. People usually forget to drink water when they do that." Jonathan almost smiled. "You are observant." Emily picked up the empty glass from the table beside him and set it on her tray. "It is part of the job." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so the nearby tables could not hear their conversation. "My firm reviews hundreds of resumes every year," he said. "Some of the smartest people in the country compete for those positions." Emily nodded calmly. "I believe that." Jonathan continued, his tone thoughtful now. "But very few of them notice the flaw you spotted tonight." Emily rested the tray against her hip, listening without interrupting. Which makes me curious about something else, Jonathan said. Emily tilted her head slightly. What is that? Jonathan studied her for a moment before answering. Why someone with your ability chooses not to compete. Emily looked across the restaurant floor for a moment, watching a young busboy clear plates from another table. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but steady. Competing requires time, she said. Jonathan waited. And sometimes responsibility arrives first, Emily continued. When that happens, priorities change. Jonathan understood that answer better than she probably realized. Success often required freedom that not everyone had. Still, something about the situation refused to leave his mind alone. You know, he said slowly, most people spend years trying to get my attention. Emily allowed a faint smile to appear again. Most people want something. Jonathan watched her carefully. And you do not. Emily lifted the tray slightly as another table signaled for service. Before she turned away, she answered his question in the calmest voice he had heard all evening. I already have something more valuable than a job offer. Jonathan frowned slightly. And what is that? Emily Carter looked at him for one brief second before walking back toward the dining room floor. A reason. The word lingered quietly in Jonathan Reed's mind long after she disappeared between the tables. The word lingered in Jonathan Reed's mind long after Emily Carter disappeared back into the flow of the restaurant. A reason. In his world, people rarely spoke that way. Most of the men and women who surrounded him talked about ambition, opportunity, leverage, and profit. Reason was not a word that appeared often in boardrooms. Yet somehow the quiet waitress had said it as if it explained everything. Jonathan remained seated for several minutes after that, watching the movement of the dining room again. Emily moved through the tables with the same calm rhythm she had maintained all evening. She greeted new guests, delivered desserts, and quietly reassured a nervous young server who had nearly dropped a tray of glasses. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had just turned down a doorway into one of the most competitive financial firms in New York City. Eventually, Jonathan stood and walked toward the exit. The host thanked him again as he stepped outside into the cool night air. Manhattan was still alive with movement. Taxi lights glowed along the street, while the glass towers above reflected thousands of windows shining against the dark sky. Jonathan entered the waiting car, but did not tell the driver to leave immediately. Instead, he looked back through the restaurant window for a moment. Inside, Emily Carter was clearing a table near the back wall, completely unaware that someone outside was still studying the quiet determination in her movements. Finally, Jonathan leaned back and said, "Office." The car pulled into traffic and disappeared into the flow of the city. 2 nights passed before Jonathan returned to the restaurant again. This time he arrived earlier in the evening, before the dining room reached its busiest hour. The host recognized him instantly and offered his usual table, but Jonathan shook his head. "I am waiting for someone," he said calmly. He chose a seat near the corner where he could see the entire dining room. When Emily Carter entered through the service doors 20 minutes later, tying the apron around her waist at the start of her shift, Jonathan noticed her immediately. She did not see him at first. She spoke briefly with the restaurant manager, checked the reservation list, and began preparing her section for the evening. It was only when she turned to greet a new guest that she finally noticed the familiar figure sitting quietly near the corner table. Emily paused for a brief second, surprised but not alarmed. Then she walked over. "Good evening, Mr. Reed," she said politely. Jonathan nodded in greeting. "Good evening, Emily." She glanced at the empty glass in front of him. "Did you come back for another financial consultation?" Jonathan allowed himself a small smile. "Something like that." Emily rested one hand lightly against the chair beside the table. "And what is the question tonight?" Jonathan reached into the folder he had brought with him and slid a thin document across the table toward her. The pages contained several charts and notes printed from a recent internal meeting at his firm. "Yesterday," he said calmly, "I presented the issue you discovered in that acquisition report." Emily looked down at the pages but did not touch them yet. "And?" Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "My entire analysis team spent 4 hours reviewing the numbers again." Emily looked back up at him. Jonathan Reed held her gaze and delivered the sentence that none of his analysts would have expected him to say. "You were right." Emily Carter looked at him for a moment as the quiet statement settled between them. The restaurant around them continued moving with the same calm rhythm of another evening shift. But for Jonathan Reed, the moment felt strangely significant. He slid the document a little closer across the table so she could see the highlighted sections. My analysts rebuilt the entire model, he said. They corrected the production assumptions. Without your observation, we would have moved forward with the investment next week. Emily finally reached for the document and glanced through the numbers briefly. She recognized the section immediately. The same production forecast. The same manufacturing capacity issue she had noticed in seconds during her shift 2 nights earlier. She closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table. I am glad they fixed it, she said simply. Jonathan studied her expression again. Most people reacted differently when they realized they had just helped prevent a mistake involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Some celebrated. Others demanded recognition. Emily Carter simply returned the folder as if it were another menu she had finished reading. Jonathan leaned back slightly in his chair. The board asked how we discovered the error, he said. Emily waited quietly. Jonathan continued. I told them the truth. Emily raised one eyebrow slightly. You told them a waitress corrected your analysts? Jonathan nodded once. Yes. Emily allowed a small amused smile to appear. I imagine that was an interesting meeting. Jonathan gave a quiet laugh. It was. He paused for a moment before speaking again. They also asked something else. Emily rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair beside the table. What was that? Jonathan folded his hands on the table in front of him. They asked if the waitress might be interested in joining our firm. Emily looked toward the dining room floor where several guests had just been seated in her section. Her shift was beginning to pick up speed again. She looked back at Jonathan. And what did you say? Jonathan answered calmly. I said the decision was not mine to make. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The soft music continued through the restaurant, while waiters moved between the tables with practiced efficiency. Finally, Emily spoke again. I appreciate the offer, she said quietly. But my situation has not changed since our last conversation. Jonathan nodded slowly. Your mother? Emily nodded once. She still needs treatment. The schedule is unpredictable. Hospital visits do not work well with office hours. Jonathan was silent for a few seconds. Then he opened his briefcase and removed a second envelope, placing it gently on the table between them. Emily looked down at it. What is that? She asked. Jonathan answered calmly. A flexible consulting contract. Remote work. No fixed hours. Emily looked up at him again, surprised. Jonathan continued in the same steady voice. You review financial models when you have time. My team gets a second pair of eyes that clearly notices things others miss. Emily studied the envelope for several seconds without touching it. You would hire a waitress as a consultant? Jonathan Reed shook his head slightly. No, he slid the envelope a little closer toward her. I would hire someone who understands that numbers tell the truth. Emily looked at the envelope again, then slowly picked it up. For the first time since they had met, her calm expression softened slightly. She slipped the envelope beside the business card in her apron pocket. Then she looked back at Jonathan Reed with quiet sincerity. Thank you, she said gently. Jonathan stood and adjusted his jacket before heading toward the door again. As he stepped out into the New York night, he realized something he had not expected to learn in a restaurant that week. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is not the least important one. Sometimes they are simply the one who has nothing to prove.